Welcome, everybody. My name is Kat Armstrong. I'm thrilled to welcome you to our webinar today. It's such a pleasure to serve Northern Seminary this way. They are hosting today, and I'm facilitating a conversation with my friend and professor, Dr. Nijay Gupta. So, Dr. Gupta is a professor at Northern Seminary of New Testament Studies. I'm thrilled to tell you that today is also book launch day. He's written many great books. I have read almost all of them, but
Wow.
this one is one of my favorites. And I'm thrilled to tell you that I got to endorse this book and be an early reader. So, congratulations, Dr. Gupta. Welcome to the webinar.
Thanks, Kat. So great to be with you. I'm excited. It is fun to be able to do this on launch day.
So I saw right before I jumped online, you are number one in a category on Amazon right now. Is that right?
Yeah, we have a launch team, and there's a group of people that have been reading the book, and we've been having discussions, and there've been reviews. So there's good buzz, and so yeah, you get your like 15 seconds of fame on Amazon, and then it's over. So I'm enjoying it while I can.
Absolutely. Let all the endorphins just hit the brain. That's awesome. Well, congratulations. I'm excited about our conversation today. I read your entire book from beginning to end, and I've got lots of questions for you that I think potential students of Northern and then folks who are just interested in theological studies are really going to enjoy. And before we start chatting, Nijay, I just wanted people to know if you're listening in right now or watching us later, you've got two more opportunities to study under Dr. Gupta. The first would be through Seminary Now. If you're not already a subscriber, you should be. I use it on a weekly basis. Dr. Gupta has several courses on Seminary Now, but I think even better would be just to enroll as a Northern student and be a part of the New Testament program. That's what I'm a part of. So be sure and check those out. We'll drop some information in the chat for you. Dr. Gupta, my first question for you is about the origin story of this book. I mean, I think you're a fan of Marvel movies and all sorts of great stories. They all have origin stories. So, what's
Yeah.
yours?
Yeah, I think of it from two different angles. One is more academic and one is more the church life. I'll start with the church life. The ideas for this book kind of came out of the early pandemic and just before, with some of the tensions in the United States with race and with politics. And I live in Portland, Oregon, the weird capital of the world. It's a highly unchurched area, and a lot of my neighbors, who are wonderful people, have a very negative view of the church. And the general feeling is, why would I go to church? Because the church reflects and even amplifies often the worst parts of culture: racism, sexism, greed, narcissism, abuse of power. Because they read the headlines, they're catching things that make national news, and there's scandal after scandal after scandal after scandal. And what's really shocking and disorienting for me is, I'm a huge fan of the Bible. I'm a huge fan of Jesus Christ. And that reputation that Christianity has in America doesn't reflect what I feel like is actually in the Bible and in my heart,
Mhm.
which is the Jesus that preached the Sermon on the Mount, the Paul that talks so much about love in 1 Corinthians 13, the early church that turned the world upside down, as it says in the book of Acts. So the question is, what's going on there? How did we get from the radical, subversive weirdness of the early Christians to where we are now? I didn't write a book that prescribes how the church should be different today. That's not really my skill set, even though I'm sure we'll get questions about that. And I'm happy to talk about that, kind of shooting from the hip. And I'd love to hear your thoughts too, Kat, since you think about the same things that I do and you're passionate about these things. What I really wanted to do is I wanted to write a book that's going to immerse people in a world that they don't know, the Roman world of the first century, and understand what the status quo was in the Roman world before Jesus: power, hierarchy, monoculturalism, exclusivity, and then kind of see the flicker of this new way, this new hodos, this new road, this new path that begins with Jesus and the apostles. And there's a quote that I like to use from a second century critic, opponent of Christianity named Celsus. This is on page 4 of my book. And he says this, I love this quote: "If all men wanted to be Christian, the Christians would no longer want them." And the funny thing about that quote, it's obviously an exaggeration, but the funny thing is what Celsus is picking up on is the early Christians were radically deviant, and they didn't want to just toe the line of the status quo. And I wanted to shake things up for Christians today. And I guess at the heart of my book is this question: would our spiritual ancestors recognize us as their true descendants? I want
Mhm.
that question to haunt people. Because when I look around social media, when I look around at the divisiveness in America politically, but sadly, it also runs across some religious lines as well. We talk about the right, we talk about the left, we talk about the libs, we talk about the fundamentalists, like we have these labels. And what I see everywhere is judgmentalism, is trolling, is lack of grace, lack of civility. And what we learn from the Christians is they took their beat from a whole different drummer, and they walked in that way. One of my favorite things the Apostle Paul says over and over again is about walking. And by walking, he means living your lifestyle, we would say. He talks about walking in love, walking
Mhm.
in truth. And what does it mean to actually assimilate and metabolize Jesus and the Spirit and Scripture in such a way? It's actually going to lead to a completely different lifestyle that is weird, sometimes dangerous, and dangerous to certain people, but also truly compelling and beautiful. That's the vision I try to cast in the book.
I think you do a great job of it, Nijay. I think what I noticed about the book is that you try to bring out at the beginning how a lot of us want to do a face palm about the headlines and the representation that Christians have, whether it's in media or sports or politics, you name the industry. But instead, you provide a really compelling vision of what early Christianity looked like, how it was different from Roman culture. And I think, although you're not prescriptive about what churches should be doing, I do think you paint a broad enough stroke of what this
Mm,
vision could be that we naturally kind of land there if you
mm,
read the book and you get to the end, whether you're a pastor or a seminary student or a marketplace business person. You have this sense of clear direction.
yeah.
I know why I should be weird. I know
Mm,
what dangers I should be inviting into my life and not. And so I think you do a great job of that. Um, I think that a lot of the interviews you may have in this season of book launch are going to talk about like 2 or 3 of my favorite chapters that are right in the middle of the book. So I wanted to try something different and talk
hmm
about the very, very end
Yeah.
because I hope that readers will take the time to get all the way through. It's a short book, it's an accessible read, but it's fascinating. And at
hmm
the end, a lot of my passion points. So there were some conversations in that last chapter that are really important to me as a woman.
Yeah.
So I wanted you to talk a little bit about Christians and their status, their
Yeah.
privilege, and their power currencies.
Well, let's start with, I think, an important observation that doesn't always get much credit because we just don't live in the Roman world anymore. And that is, in the Roman world, to worship a god was to worship with a statue of that god. So if you walk into a Roman city in the first century, you will be bombarded by statues. In fact, this is what Luke means in the book of Acts when Paul walks into Athens and he is dizzy with the sight of so many idols. This was the Jewish term for cult statues, and these statues would be everywhere. So in my book, I liken it to billboards. So if you went to Times Square, you're just going to see all these signs and billboards. And I'm sure someone coming from another country that doesn't have a city like New York City is going to be overwhelmed. It's going to be like that with statues. Why is that important? Two things. The Bible again and again repeats the idea that we become like the gods we worship. and we conform. So in the Old Testament, it's a criticism of idols. And
Mhm.
if an idol can't hear, because it's made of stone, then the people that worship it won't be able to hear. If an idol can't see, you won't be able to see. If an idol doesn't have breath, you won't have breath, which is why when Israel worships a cow, right, calf, the golden calf, they become dumb like that calf. This is repeated throughout the Old Testament. Second, in the Roman world, there was the tendency to construct an understanding of the gods that make the gods looking more and more like themselves, like a Roman, and where you blend the two together. So, for example, and this is not actually in my books, you're getting some bonus material right now. As I've given lectures on this, I show a picture of the Emperor Claudius,
Mhm.
and a big statue of Claudius. It's actually in the Vatican now, but it's from the 1st century. And he's dressed as Jupiter, the greatest god in the pantheon. And you're meant to align Claudius with the great god Jupiter. When Caesar Augustus, the first major emperor, died, and he had a funeral procession, his body was dressed in the garb of Jupiter. One of the greatest gods to be praised and elevated next to Jupiter in Rome was the goddess Roma, which is the spirit of Rome.
Mhm.
What does that tell us? When we put up statues, we tend to say, that's God, and then we start to align ourselves with that statue. Why am I telling you this? It matters who you worship because there's this gravitational magnetic attraction to emulate that thing you worship, whether it's a sports figure, whether it's a military hero, whether it's a celebrity, the way that we
Taylor Swift.
dress.
Taylor
Well, I
Swift.
didn't name names.
Taylor
And
Swift.
Tay Tay, if you're listening, if you're watching, we love you. Give me tickets.
We're so
Um,
happy for you.
she gives charity everywhere she goes. Okay, let's not talk about Tay Tay. But the Christians, this is amazing because in the Roman world, you dreamed about the gods and you dreamed that you would just get a chance to see just a glimpse of their glory somehow, a sign in heaven, lightning bolt or whatever. And what's amazing with the Christian God is he comes to us. And one of the things I learned about the incarnation, the beauty of the incarnation, is the fact of Jesus coming into the flesh says something about, it makes the flesh all the more important. It makes our bodies, it makes humanity all the more important. And then, as an extension, it makes all humans important. We Americans live today, if you're watching in America or Canada, you probably learned some of these things from America as well, but a lot of the Western world, we just take for granted the inherent dignity of the individual, at least in theory. We didn't get that from Rome. We got a lot of things from Rome, but the inherent dignity of the individual person, we did not get from Rome. So you'll know about this cat, but listeners and viewers will be interested. There was a common practice in the Roman world called infant exposure. This was the idea that if you had a child and you didn't want the child because it had a defect, an illness, or it was a girl, or some other reason, you were too poor to take care of it, whatever it was, you would leave it kind of out in the forest or out on a
Mhm.
hillside to die or to be taken into slavery, or you would sell it into slavery, him or her into slavery. And so there would be people patrolling these locations taking children, and that's how a lot of children end up in slavery, is they're taken when they're young. Christians opposed this. They opposed these practices, and they affirmed the inherent dignity of every individual. So let me give you a couple of examples from the book. There is a Roman statesman, not Christian, named Pliny. And Pliny, we have this famous letter of Pliny to one of his friends, Tiro. And Tiro was an up-and-coming military officer and would-be statesman. And Pliny notices that Tiro is kind of middle management, and he's cozying up to his inferiors, people lower than rank to him, because he wants to be in their good graces, be the fun boss, be the cool boss. It's like when you're, babysitting kids, you want them to like you, and then you realize that doesn't work out that well for parents when you have to be stern, or when you're a teacher. But Tiro is cozying up to his inferiors, buddying with them. And Pliny notices this, and Pliny says, I know what you're doing. I get it, but it's dangerous. And he has this famous saying, and it's in my book, the most unequal thing is the appearance of equality where equality doesn't exist.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
What he's saying is society exists according to certain rules, rules of hierarchy, what we call stratification, that people
Mm-hmm.
live and die in a certain layer. Think of the caste system. You live and die in a certain layer, a strand, a thin strand of a pyramid. And you could try to reach up to the next strand, but you cannot move very far. That's just the way it is. And then we get the Christians that come along and they say, there are two things I pick up in my book on this. One is there's this saying that's actually repeated by a number of different apostles. And when you see that, that's really something to take note of because they don't tend to share information that way. And it's God does not play favorites. The Old
Yeah.
English is God is no respecter of
Yeah.
persons. I can't tell you how dangerous it
Yeah.
would be to utter those words in the Roman world.
Mm-hmm.
And, think about the way we fly. I know you fly, you travel a lot for speaking, and I do for work. And I fly enough that I get bumped up to first class. You can click this beautiful little button that says, "Would you like a courtesy upgrade if one is available?" Because I fly so much, I get these points. I don't buy a first class ticket, but sometimes they'll bump me, and I'll take it.
Oh, yeah.
And I feel terrible sitting in there and these people walk by and you're just like, I'm so sorry. But
That's the difference between us. I'm like, see y'all later. I click that button.
I still click the button, Kat. But my point is we know what stratification is like because that is a form of it. That is a form of privilege. And I take advantage of that. But imagine all of society is like that. Imagine if you went to the grocery store and they have first class and they wait the least, and then you have middle class, they wait a little bit, and then you have low class, you wait the most. Or you get driven around the aisles on a golf cart, but the other people, the elderly, have to walk if they don't have money. Imagine all of life were like that. That's the Roman world.
Mm-hmm.
Rome perfected stratification. And the Christians say, God doesn't care. The one high God, the ruler, creator, and judge of heaven and earth, doesn't care whether you're elite or low class, whether you're male or female, whether you're slave or free, whether you're Scythian, barbarian, Roman, Greek, doesn't matter. Nobody cares. God does not care what's on your resume. He doesn't care. And you say, but I've done good things. He doesn't care about that either. I've done bad things. He doesn't care. In terms of how important you are. Now, of course, he wants you to be good for goodness sake. But he doesn't care in terms of the sun shining, as Jesus says. Whether the sun shines on you or the rain, you're all equal in the eyes of God. That was extremely, extremely dangerous.
So this super socialized, stratified society, there's not a lot of upward mobility. This
Right.
is a world that many of us can't conceive of. And for those of us who feel like we are on the bottom of some hierarchy, even in the States, even now, you get the sense that this is why Jesus liberated us from these types of hierarchies to create his new family where everyone gets included. It's so beautiful, so compelling. But I would like to talk about what determined that kind of status and privilege. Is it mostly money? Is it the family you're born into? Is it the slavery system? Like, what determined that kind of position on the ladder?
Yeah, so we're going deep here. I like this. You're getting a little seminary class here for those watching. So scholars talk about two types of honor, and honor was a big deal in the Roman world. Ascribed honor and achieved honor. So ascribed honor is things that you have no control over that you were kind of just born into. So that would be things like who your parents are, right? It's really interesting to me when I see like a young celebrity and I realize they are like the daughter or son of another celebrity.
Mm-hmm.
And you realize, okay, there's some sort of nepotism going on there. And, that's pretty natural. And the Roman world existed that way where, the senators were part of a senatorial class. You don't have blue collar senators.
Right.
There was the equestrian class, which is just below the senatorial class. So you had a class system that determined your privilege and honor. Men, generally speaking, were of more importance than women. Men could vote, women couldn't. Men could hold public office, men could fight in battle. This is something I learned more recently, Kat, and you'll probably be discouraged by this. Uh, Before the age of adulthood in the Roman world, there were really three purposes for a child: to grow up. They were aiming to grow up,
Hmm.
men in particular,
Yeah.
to fight in war, which was
Hmm.
to protect Rome, to get married, which is to
Hmm.
expand Rome,
Hmm.
and to participate in the civic good, which is to help Rome flourish. And women couldn't fight in war, and they couldn't hold civic office, and their job at home was primarily to make sure that the household was flourishing.
Hmm.
And so they had a whole different place, and they generally speaking, women were meant to be in the domus, the home, and not the forum, the public space. You have women outliers all over the place, and we could talk about that later if you want. But generally speaking, the image of the woman was the domestic woman who is good at woolworking, loyal, charming, all of that. And then you had achieved honor. Achieved honor are the things you do for the greatness of Rome. You fight in battle and are a war
Right.
hero. You they had this thing called patronage, where if you're wealthy and important, you collect clients around you, which are people that kind of kiss up to you. In exchange, you give them favors. And so the more you had, the more prestigious you were. So kind of think of like an entourage. So the bigger
Hmm.
your entourage. And there was nobility, like if you stand up against an enemy, fight off pirates, that sort of thing. But those were the ways that you collected honor. It was easy if you're a Roman citizen. It's easier if you're a man. It's easier if you've never been a slave. Slaves could be freed, and they were called freed persons, but they lived with a mark uh,
Hmm.
of lowness, a mark of debasement, because they were once a slave, kind of like an ex-con label
Hmm.
in our society today.
Hmm. Yeah, I think, Nijay, some of the folks listening are going to go, this is the kind of stuff I wish I knew about New Testament context as I read the New Testament. And one of the classes I took with you, we focused primarily on this very
Yeah,
topic,
yeah.
reading all about slaves in the New Testament world and what that looked like. Even some of the books you had us read were really illuminating. Recently, I took a class with Dr. McKnight, and it was all about Highland's book on social mobility for women and the rights of women during this time. And essentially, it was a mojo dojo casa culture. This is like very, very hard for women.
Hmm.
Or slaves to reach status, privilege, power currencies. And so I appreciate you talking about that. I'm curious, before we move on to my next question, do you think we still do those things now? Do we qualify people, privileged people? How do we do that now? I know it's a lot different.
Yes, but so much of America draws its inspiration from Rome. We glorify a lot of the same things. Well, I joke sometimes when I give podcasts on this. I was watching this really interesting discussion with Trevor Noah, who's one of my favorite cultural critics. He's talking about the American national anthem. And Trevor Noah is from South Africa, and but he lives in America. He has a lot of great observations, and he says it's so weird to him that the national anthem is about war, the bombs bursting and all of that, because other national anthems don't tend to glorify war. So, for example, Trevor Noah's father, I think, is German, and he talks about in Germany, they're the one they've had for, 70, 80, 90 years is more about agriculture and fields and flourishing and this and that. And so it's weird to have bombs bursting, and then for America to say we're going to play it in a local competition, not a national one, which makes sense, but a local one. This idea that we glorify war and we're so proud of fighting off the enemy, and we protect, we emphasize how we protect our borders and all that. But in terms of stratification, I think ours are less overt, but still extremely rigid. And so we don't just say, white people are more important. We don't just come out and say it. but it comes through in other ways.
Oh, yeah.
And so that actually makes it more dangerous with its subtleties.
Yep.
But I would say probably the biggest stratification we have is wealth.
Yep.
Wealth and privilege. For example, in a lot of countries, getting a college education is cheap.
Yep.
Getting a graduate education is affordable, even if it's
Mhm.
not cheap. And here, I get the question over and over and over again, can I really only do a PhD if I have money and privilege? And there are scholarships, they're few and far between, but it's tough. It's really tough. So I think money is a big problem in terms of privilege, access, power,
Mhm.
even seminary. I work at a seminary. I can't tell you how many people want to go to seminary and they just can't afford it.
Mhm.
Or they want to take some classes and they just can't afford it. And I think as America becomes less Christian, there are fewer scholarships because churches aren't just giving money. Pastors, let's say, aren't paid as much. So we're putting seminary further and further out of reach for people. I think wealth is a big deal.
Mhm.
I think location is a big deal.
Yep.
And, if you're from no place special versus if you're from someplace special, people do treat those things as significant. I think it makes all the difference in the world. Jesus is from nowhere, Nazareth. I just love Jesus' story of being from a nobody from nowhere, and how much he honors and gives hometown um, hometown warmth to those of us who are from nowhere. I'm from nowhere, and I love that I share that with Jesus.
So it sounds like, Dr. Gupta, that it's different, and but I'm also hearing that there is a lot of crossover, that race, money, and location have a lot to do with the stratification that, although it's not as overt, still
Yeah,
exists where I'm a student and here in the US. So I'm hearing that. I think that's really interesting to think about the differences, but also the parallels. And I think that's why your book made such an impact on me a couple months ago when I read it. Just thinking about how, um, what's the word? How
mm,
relevant of this conversation is to have. And I thought it was really funny that all of this intersects that hilarious meme out there that talks about how much men think about the Roman Empire, that this is like all they think about. And my friend Dr. Sandra Glahn jokes, she thinks about it all the time too, because it's the
mm,
backdrop of the New Testament. And so much of what we learn about Jesus, we have to know about these cultural markers. So I wanted to ask you about slave Jesus. You talked about Jesus
mm.
being a nobody from
Yeah,
nowhere.
yeah,
And Jesus is portrayed as a slave. Many times in the New Testament, the authors talk about Christ followers being slaves of God.
hmm,
And I know this was offensive to Rome. So can you
yeah.
unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, this is really prominent in Philippians, where Paul actually introduces himself and Timothy as slaves of Jesus Christ. But then in the famous Christ hymn, Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 11, Paul says, though he was in the form of God, he did not consider equality with God something to be exploited, but he humbled himself, he lowered himself, taking the form of a slave. Now that's interesting because technically Jesus wasn't a doulos, he wasn't a slave. Because a slave is someone that's owned by another person legally in the Roman world. But what are they saying? I think they're saying two things. They're saying that fall from that lowering from absolute glorification to Nazareth was like a king becoming a slave. Paul's painting a picture. Second, though, and I think this is really, really important, is the way Jesus died. There, Rome had multiple forms of execution. You could be beheaded, you could be stabbed. There had kind of hanging. They had drawn and quartering sorts of things. You had poison. You had all kinds of stuff. But you could be burned alive. I mean, they were very creative. But crucifixion was meant to be the worst
Hmm.
in terms of pain, but also in terms of shame. Because if you just stab somebody, and they die, that's normally done, that's not done as a spectacle. Or if you poison somebody, it's not really done as a spectacle. But there are ancient writers that talk about crucifixion as something that where the crosses are put in very public places, almost like a highway. And we tend to see paintings of like two or three people, like Jesus and the criminals on the cross, between two thieves. We think there are three people, but the image we get from the Roman world would be that there might be dozens or hundreds or even thousands of people crucified
Wow.
at the same time. So we get this, for example, with the famous Spartacus slave revolt, where there are these groups of slaves that ran away and began this counteroffensive against the leaders, and then they were rounded up en masse and crucified. And the picture painted is of just a lot of people at once. And this was known as, it wasn't only slaves who were crucified, obviously, because Jesus was crucified, but it was widely known as the punishment of slaves, because this was notoriously the punishment of a slave who has mistreated their master, like killed their master, or revolted, or like gone to war against their masters. And this was used as a public deterrent against these kinds of crimes. So I think one of the reasons that Paul says Jesus came like a slave is that he died like a slave.
Yep.
He died with the least of these in the most debasing and humiliating way, to the point where he cries out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He's obviously quoting a psalm, but this is interesting. Some of the early manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark think that is so unfathomable that Jesus would say, "Why have you forsaken me?" They actually changed the wording to "Why have you dishonored me?" Because they just can't handle the depths of what Jesus went through on the cross. It's too much for them, these scribes that are transcribing the text. And so for him, for a deity in the ancient world that claims supremacy, Jesus is Lord of all, salvation is found in no other name under heaven and earth, to die a slave's death says something about human beings.
Yeah.
Says something about the so-called least in society, and gives dignity and honor to them by saying, I stand with you. And Gospel of John, interestingly enough, scholars say Luke gives a story of the ascension where Jesus ascends into heaven, but John doesn't. So most Gospel of John scholars argue that John's version of the enthronement of Christ is actually the crucifixion.
Yeah.
He shows his highest glory in being lifted up on the cross in crucifixion to show the supremacy of his grace and glory and love.
I wonder if they can edit this out, Nijay, because I'm trying to think of that. Is it Morna Hooker that wrote? I'll have to ask you later about a book that I read on this, because it's really interesting to me. So I joke often, and I say often in my ministry that the longer I know Jesus, the more I love him.
Yeah.
It makes me emotional just thinking about this man who's not like any other person that I've ever known, and that he would come to earth, that he would submit himself to this, that he would die this kind of death to dignify the people at the bottom of these hierarchies that he came to abolish, blows me away. And when I was preparing for this conversation, I wrote down some titles that I would give Jesus: the ultimate status leveler,
Yeah.
the ultimate jubilee. And so I know that he's good news, but could you expound a little bit on that for those of us who need some hope in Jesus and hope in a world that feels more stratified than it should be? Why is this such good news?
Yeah, the example I give from Paul's letters is his letter to Philemon. So Philemon is a slave master, a Christian slave master. I know that's hard for us to process, but
I hate it.
he's a Christian leader. He probably leads a house church, and he has a slave named Onesimus who wasn't a Christian, and leaves Philemon's house. We don't know why. We don't know under what circumstances. Somehow is with Paul, and Paul's in prison. Here's the gospel from Paul. So then you're wondering why he hasn't already accepted the gospel from Philemon. And then Paul does the unthinkable. He sends Onesimus back to Philemon. We do get the impression they had some falling out. And in a normal circumstance, if a slave has done something wrong and is brought home, there were actually professional private slave catchers. The police would do this, but there's actually a ancient play called The Slave Catchers. We don't have the play, but we know what it's about. And so if a slave is brought home, a few things pretty regularly happen to them. Either they are sold into a worse situation, or they're sent off to work on a farm, like let's say the master is a estate owner. Now, slaves could gain their freedom if their masters grant them that. And the best situation is to be in a household where you're being seen a lot by the master so that they can take pity on you, befriend you, and then feel enough kind of good vibes, they're going to free you. If you get sent to a plantation to work, you're never seen again, and you'll just be there till you die. Or, number 3, you're going to get beaten severely, and there were very few protections. There were some protections against killing your slaves because they're a workforce and they're important to society in the Roman eye. But so if under normal circumstances, if Onesimus is sent home, he can expect to get really rough treatment one way or another. His life is going to get far worse. But what's amazing is that Paul sends Onesimus home to Philemon. And actually many scholars, including myself, think that he sends Onesimus as the letter carrier, which means he now becomes Paul's representative. He's an agent of Paul, which is crazy. And then he delivers this letter. And in the letter, Paul says, Philemon, if you consider me your partner, your koinos, your equal, and assuming Philemon's elite, and everyone loves Paul because he's an apostle. He's saying, if you consider me on the same level as you, a partner in this, treat Onesimus as you would treat me. Now that is not Pliny's vision of equality. Pliny would say, wait a second, you are messing with categories that ought not to be messed with. There was actually a discussion in the Senate at one point about whether they should make slaves wear special clothing so you could identify who's a slave. And someone chimed in and said, but if the slaves buy clothing would know how many there are, they would overpower us.
Yeah.
So they decided not to do that. And Seneca, a famous philosopher, said to slave masters, you have as many enemies as you have slaves, meaning watch your back because they're going to look for every opportunity to stab you in the back. So you kept your slaves in check. And Paul is saying, welcome him as you would welcome me. Basically, treat him as royalty. Paul's saying, imagine if I showed up to your house. So I think of the parable of the prodigal son. And the son shows up, and the father surprisingly says, put a robe on him, kill the fatted calf, put the gold ring on him, throw a party. And this is exactly the same concept that Paul is applying to the estranged slave Onesimus. And he says, welcome him back, not as a slave, meaning don't beat him, don't punish him, don't threaten him, don't sell him to a worse situation, but as a beloved brother. I think that's actually recalling the parable of the prodigal son, because you have the older brother who's kind of jealous. Now, Paul doesn't directly mess with slavery in that situation. He doesn't directly say to free him, but the sociology, we call this social economics, is radical. It's radical. And the question this prompts for us is, who is Onesimus? Is he a slave, which Aristotle referred to slaves as living or animate tools? They're just tools. They're dispensable.
Objects. Yeah.
They're just objects. Are they tools, or are they the most precious because they're human beings? And that's revolutionary. I mean, it's that kind of thinking that finally led to abolition.
Yeah.
It's that kind of thinking that fueled even parts of the civil rights movement, parts like Martin Luther King Jr. talking about
Hmm.
going to the promised land, some of those kinds of things are evoking some of those ideas. This has a place in society for changing how we look at the individual. Like how much attention do we pay to the up and down lives of celebrities and royals? Do we attribute the same value
Hmm.
to the blue collar workers
Yeah.
around us? The same amount of let's raise money to make sure this person makes it through.
Hmm.
Healthcare. Healthcare is a privilege in America. It's sad. It's so sad, but healthcare is a privilege,
Yeah.
and it should be a right. It should be a
Hmm.
right. People shouldn't have to worry about whether they can get their cancer treated or not.
Right.
These are ways that Christians can step in and say things have to change. If we believe what Jesus believed, every person matters, no matter who they are.
Yeah. So powerful, Nijay. I mean, because you've had me in class, that I'm going to ask why, if Paul goes this far, I have my own theories, but why does he not just go ahead and abolish slavery? And it bothers me so much.
Oh boy. Scholars go round and round on this question. I think a common answer is that the Romans were in charge, and Jesus didn't really have that on his ministry radar. He wanted to transform the new revolution, the people that were going to, when he says, repent, the kingdom is at hand, he's
Yeah.
recruiting for the new revolution.
Hmm.
These people that are going to turn the world upside down. And he actually says, we're not going to lord it over people. We're going to do this from the bottom up, not from the top down. I think when it came to the apostles, I do think that they thought the end of the world was going to happen soon and
Soon.
very soon,
Yeah.
like a thief in the night. And
Yeah.
that thief is coming soon.
Yeah.
And so when I look at things like the household codes where Paul says, slaves, be slaves, but be obedient, be patient. Masters, continue to be masters, but be good masters. I think he was saying, this is the way it is, but we can
Hmm.
transform what is into something beautiful.
Hmm.
Some scholars like Scott McKnight say that the apostles were blind to the evil of the institution of slavery. They weren't blind to the evils of people's experiences in slavery and the inherent problems of disequality, but they were blind to that there was anything else. And so the example I gave in Tell Her Story, which I'll just repeat now, is my youngest daughter, had cancer from ages 1 to 3. She's
Hmm.
fully cancer free. She's 12 years old. She plays volleyball. She's very healthy. But I remember when I was giving her chemotherapy, there was like a skull and crossbones on the bottle,
Hmm.
and I would have to crush the pills because she was 1 year old. She can't swallow a pill. She doesn't know what medicine is. She doesn't like the taste of it. So we'd crush up these pills, put them in apple juice, and put it in a syringe, and we would tickle her, and then we'd squirt it in her mouth. And the doctor told us, the oncologist told us, now she's going to spit some of it out, but because we have to give her the full treatment, you have to crush new pills and you have to give it to her again.
Mm.
And he said, your impulse will be, I'll just give her a little less because it's, it's essentially poison. I'm not saying you shouldn't do chemo, but it's essentially poison. I mean, it's designed to kill the cancer, but it's killing other things as well. It's like a shotgun. It's not super strategic in what it kills. And I remember, and I had to wear gloves. The doctor said, make sure you wear gloves when you're crushing these pills because you don't want to get the poison on you.
Wow.
And you don't want to inhale it or ingest it. You're supposed to wear a mask. I didn't wear a mask most of the time. And I thought to myself, I'm just worried about inhaling this, and she's actually putting it in her body. And I kept thinking to myself, and I had to do this, we had to do this for over a year. I kept thinking to myself, this is barbaric.
Yeah.
And I hoped and prayed and dreamed, and I still dream of something better than chemo, but I don't know what it is.
Hmm.
I dream about it. I wish for it. I know it's possible. But this is what we have, and it sucks.
So essentially, what your view is that it was beyond the imagination, that this system would not exist. And I don't know. I mean, we were in class together for Onesimus and Philemon,
Yes,
all
yes.
all of these topics, and maybe it's because I'm a mom, but when I tell my 10-year-old son, I know you're going to clean your room today.
Yeah.
I know it.
Yeah.
I know you're going to do it, aren't you? You're going to do it. Just like as if I were going to walk through it and I've got a vacuum today. I know that you're going to clean your room. Instead of saying, go clean your room, go clean it right now. That I read all the books and I still feel like Paul's tone is, I know you're going to welcome him. So
Yeah.
I don't, yeah, but I'm with you that this may have been beyond their imagination. But thank you for addressing that. I do feel like it's an elephant in the room when we bring up these topics. And I feel like your book was a really good runway
Hmm.
for these kinds of conversations. I wanted you to answer one more before I get to some of the questions we've received from people who are logged in right now and watching right now. I wanted you to talk about this Roman festival you mentioned in the last chapter of your book, and I'm scared to say it. Saturnalia?
Saturnalia. Yeah. Saturnalia.
Saturnalia. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
you talked a lot about the social inversion of this festival. Just introduce us to it if we've never heard of it.
Saturnalia is wild. So it takes place in December. It started out as, a few days, then it kind of grew into like 10 days. And it's basically a combination of Halloween, Christmas, Mardi Gras, and 4th of July. I mean, it was a bash and it was all partying. And the whole idea was Romans believed that long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away, there was the reign of the god Saturn, which is the sun, the reign of the god Saturn, and the whole earth was equal. There was no class, there was no hierarchy. It was like hippy dippy Garden of Eden kind of thing, frolicking in the fields, no slaves, no status, no money. Everybody had food. They even say everybody shared everything in common, very Acts
Yeah.
chapter 2. And so they take this time to celebrate the golden age. And this was an occasion where if you were a slave, you were allowed to dress up, like think of like Halloween, dress up like your master. And yeah, I imagine thinking of like wearing clothes way too big for you, just so it looks kind of silly. And you like wag your finger at your master, and the master has to sit at the table, maybe have a dunce cap on, and takes orders. Eat faster, and then they eat faster. It's kind of like this jocular parody, and you could like. It's the only time of the year you could put up protest signs against the emperor. Kind of like, I remember Obama was coming through uh, uh, a city once that I lived in, and people came out and gave him the middle finger. Like all these people came out and gave Obama the middle finger as his motorcade was driving through. It was the one time a year in Rome you could do that. And women could, be out and about. Children could be running around the streets. And if you were to just be on holiday in the Roman Empire during that time, you might think, oh my gosh, they have an understanding of equality. They have an understanding of freedom. But some of the writers from the ancient world and some of the historians now talk about it not as true freedom, not even as a vision they want realized, but as a snapshot of silliness to prove that you actually can't live that way. It would be complete chaos, complete ridiculousness. There's this movie my family watched called Yes Day. Have you seen this movie?
Oh, yes.
With
Many,
Jennifer
many
Garner?
times.
Yeah, it's a fan favorite in our house. And it's this idea that whatever the kids ask for, the parents will do that day. And it's just a lot of silliness. The whole point is you can't live like that. Now, they say you got to be more open, whatever, but you can't really live like that. And that was what Rome said. They said you can't actually live like that. So what they saw it as is something to give people hope 1 week a year so that they won't revolt the other 51 weeks. So let me give you another example. I don't know if you're a Hunger Games fan, but the name Pan Am actually comes from a satire writer named Juvenal, who talked about how the Roman emperor harshly oppressed the people, keeping them poor, taxing the heck out of them, policing the heck out of them. But to prevent them from revolting, he gave them gladiatorial games and invited the poor to come out. He'd give them some Cracker Jacks and peanuts and a free lollipop. And what this text says from Juvenal is he tried to ameliorate them with bread and circuses. Panem comes from the word bread. Panem circuses, bread and circuses. And this is kind of what Saturnalia did. And the whole point of it for elites was, we will tolerate this 1 week a year, the frivolity and silliness, to let the slaves blow off some steams, to let the lower class, but so they also know this is all they'll ever have. They get a few days, and that's all you get.
Mm-hmm.
And yet when the apostles come along in Acts chapter 2 with the giving of the Holy Spirit given to everyone, the idea is we need to actually make this an eternal reality rather than a once a week party, a once a year party.
It's so good. I hope y'all make it to the end of the book. I hope you get your copy at launch today. So I want to make that plug one more time. Go and get Strange Religion. Nijay's done an excellent job of making this accessible. So what you experienced right now is what you would get in a class with him at Northern. I can testify. But Nijay, before I let you go, I wanted to ask you some questions we received from folks who are watching. One from someone named Harriet. She asked about the book After Jesus, Before Christianity. It's by Scott and Tulsig and Vern Combe.
Sure.
She wanted to know about the commonalities and differences between your book and theirs.
I looked into this book because Harriet already asked me the question. I want to be prepared. So I haven't read the book, but what I've looked at from the book is they make similar arguments about the strangeness of Christianity, but they say that the strangeness started with Jesus and then was domesticated by the apostles. I'm more positive towards the whole New Testament than these writers. I think what we often want is simplicity, and I think what we have in the New Testament is complexity. We have the complexity of resistance and accommodation. And accommodation means early Christianity knew they couldn't be defiant all of the time. Paul says, pay your taxes. Paul says, have a positive, seasoned with salt witness in the world. Paul says in 1 Thessalonians, work quietly. How can you say work quietly and starting a revolution? I think he wanted to say, you got to take it step by step. And you have to make sure that you show in every step that you're trying to do what's good for all people, that you're above reproach, unassailable. So I don't think these authors appreciate that complexity. They want simplicity. I just don't think we can offer that to them.
Okay, so next question from my buddy Derek. What are some of the practices for the church today that recover some of the strangeness of the Christian faith in the early church?
This is tough because Christianity, early Christianity, in terms of rituals, they kept it minimal because the point wasn't specific rituals that appease the gods. It was the practices that were going to reinforce the culture that you're creating around Jesus. So I don't know if I wouldn't start with practices because it actually has to start in the heart. It has to start, early Christianity was the only religion, I mean Judaism as well, but was the only religion in the Roman Empire that focused so much on the heart. That's one of the things that made it dangerous because you can't really quantify that. But I would say I would say my biggest advice that I give to people after they read the book and they're hungry, which is kind of what, Kat, you've been saying too, how do people do that hunger, is, in soccer, sometimes when a team loses a lot and they're trying to figure out why they're losing so much. There was a coach here in Portland. He'd always say, we need a gut check. And a gut check means we got to figure out what's actually in us. We have to spend some time. Some people call this an autopsy. I think that's a little bit gross, but I think it's the same concept of, okay, we're going to take a time out. I talk about my book as the big red button because I feel like the church has kind of like a rocket gone off its trajectory. It's going to explode somewhere where it doesn't belong. And I want my book to be a big red button to say, time out, let's stop and figure out how we've gotten off track. So I kind of shy away from, I know people want like what do I do? What do I do? What I do? I think personally, I think we have to be careful not to jump right into things and start with just a period of discernment. And what I tend to tell people is what Jesus created, when people talk about the kingdom of God, what is it? And how do I make sure I'm following King Jesus? It's a king with a people and a culture, and sometimes we miss that culture part. And that culture is what makes that particular group of people distinctive, what makes them tick, what makes them live the way they do. I know this is like Church 101, if you're a pastor out there, but you can preach all the greatest messages, theologically true, but if you don't change the culture of your church, the people aren't going to follow you. They're not going to follow Jesus, let's put it that way. And so I think we have to get down to the bottom of what's actually motivating us, what's on the inside. And for me personally, I know this isn't answering Derek's question head on. I started seeing a spiritual director a few years ago, and he it's funny, he gets paid to basically ask the question, what do you think God is telling you? It's funny, like, I'll talk about all these problems, I'm stressed out, and he's very well qualified. But he'll just say, if Jesus were standing in this room with us right now, what do you think Jesus would say about this? And I can't tell you how often I think to myself, why did that not occur to me to think about that yesterday? Why do I have to come here and be with this friend to tell me this? But that's what he's there for. I mean, that's what this spiritual director is there to say, what's your spiritual conscience telling you? I was, that I should do this. I think you should do that then. I think that gut check is the place to start. Where have we gone off track? How have we ended up where we are? That's just some advice I give. I'm going to keep thinking about the practices question because I know people want to know.
Nijay, thank you. I think this is a great place to stop and just to say we appreciate you so much, your voice in the kingdom, the contributions you make in the academy and the church, and deposits you made in us today in this conversation. But I do think you landed the plane on some really practical applications for the people who are ready. I think the gut check sounds like number one. And then number two, to be asking that question, what do you think God is communicating to you? What do you think Jesus is telling you to do in a more personal, localized way that will move towards cultural change that then can really change institutions and culture at large? And so I feel encouraged that you have given us some practical application. But congratulations on the book. We're really so happy for you.
Thanks so much. I just want to mention one thing. I hope this is resonant. If people want next steps and maybe some culture shiftings, I recommend John Mark Comer's book, Practicing the Way. As I've been listening to John Mark on various podcasts and things, I don't have his book yet. I just think, gosh, this is what I'm talking about. So I highly, highly encourage people to check out as next steps, John Mark Comer's, another Portland native, Practicing the Way. Thanks, Kat.
Thanks, Nijay. You guys, if you're interested in some courses, please check out Northern Seminary. You should have the link in the chat. And if not, just go online to seminary.edu and hopefully we'll get to see you in class someday. All right, guys, thanks so much for being with us, and we'll see you next time.
Right. Thank you, Kat. That was awesome.
All right. Good job,
You done
guys.
good.
Great stuff, guys.
So fun. Nijay, that was so helpful. I think,
It was.
yeah, I saw my friend Christina in the chat a bunch. And so